The moment Cameron pressed that delete button, I felt something shift inside me. Not the grief she was expecting. Not the panic. Something quieter than that. And far more dangerous. 31 people were sitting in that conference room. Analysts, account managers, junior consultants, a few senior directors who almost never showed up to routine service reviews. Every one of them was watching the main screen as 73 pages of my work disappeared in a single click. 18 months of site visits, custom maintenance protocols, reorganized warehouse systems, and rebuilt project schedules. Gone. Cameron turned away from the screen with that calm, composed expression she always wore when she believed she had just won something. She was waiting for me to collapse. I did not give her that. I nodded once, gathered my folder from the table, and sat back down. I kept my expression neutral. I kept my hands steady. I did not look at the colleagues who were shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, or the ones who were staring at their laptops to avoid making eye contact with anyone. I just sat there, quietly, with a feeling I did not have a name for yet. It was only later, sitting in my car in the parking garage, that I understood what that feeling was. It was relief. Because in that moment, I finally had everything I needed. But to understand why, you need to go back to the beginning. You need to understand what I walked into when I took that job, and what it cost me to stay long enough to let it finish properly. My name is Patrick Steele. I was 48 years old when this happened. I had spent 24 years inside the world of manufacturing and industrial operations, not in conference rooms or business schools, but on concrete floors, in loading docks, inside facilities where a broken hydraulic line could cost a company $10,000 an hour, and nobody had time for a polished presentation about it. I started right out of high school, entry level at a steel plant in Ohio. Safety glasses, work boots, long shifts. The kind of job where you learn fast or you become a liability. Over the years, I moved through quality control, logistics scheduling, plant management, and eventually operations consulting. I had worked alongside maintenance crews, warehouse supervisors, and freight dispatchers. I understood the difference between a problem that looked operational and one that was actually cultural. I had seen companies lose millions of dollars not because their equipment was bad, but because no one had ever sat down and looked honestly at how the work actually moved. That was why Apex Industrial Solutions offered me the Senior Operations Analyst position. Or at least, that was what I believed at the time. The pitch sounded clean. Help industrial clients improve their processes. Reduce waste. Identify bottlenecks. Bring practical experience into rooms where too many consultants had never touched a real machine. After more than 2 decades of being the person who figured out what was actually wrong, I thought this role would let me use everything I had learned, without constantly having to justify why it mattered. What I did not know during that interview was that Apex was already in serious trouble. Not financially, not yet, but in the way that precedes financial trouble. They were losing clients, quietly at first, then faster. Industrial business owners were finishing their contracts and not renewing. Some left without explanation. Others sent polite emails that said things like, "We are going in a different direction," which is the professional way of saying, "Your service did not work." My first week at Apex, I started pulling old client files. I thought maybe I needed to catch up, understand what had been done before so I could build on it. What I found instead made me sit very still at my desk for a long time. The reports were beautiful, formatted perfectly, professional language throughout, charts, graphs, summary tables, executive overviews. They looked exactly like what a serious consulting firm should produce, but the advice inside them was nearly identical across every client. Improve efficiency, reduce waste, optimize workflow, implement best practices. The same phrases, rearranged slightly, sent to a steel fabrication shop and a freight company and a construction firm, as if all 3 businesses had the same problem. The same people, and the same floor plan. The analyst before me had lasted 6 months and left without a word of transition documentation. I had assumed that was carelessness. By the end of my first month, I understood it was something else entirely. My direct supervisor was a woman named Cameron Brooks. She had an MBA, a corner office with glass walls, and a management philosophy built entirely around measurable efficiency. To Cameron, consulting was a production system. Client problems came in. Standardized solutions went out. Billable hours were tracked. Reports were filed. And everything had to fit inside the approved time allocation or it counted against you. She was not cruel in the obvious way. She never raised her voice. She never sent aggressive emails. She was polished and measured and always smiling just enough to make a criticism feel like guidance. But for my first week, I could feel her watching me the way someone watches a piece of equipment they are not sure they should have purchased. I had too much experience in the wrong direction. I asked too many questions that did not belong in her workflow. I cared about details that did not fit her dashboard. Cameron had never spent a day inside a real production facility, but she spoke about industrial efficiency with the quiet confidence of someone who had built a formula and trusted it completely. I was about to prove the formula was wrong. The first client who showed me exactly how much damage that formula had done was Hudson Reeves. Hudson ran Reeves Steel Fabrication, a 200-person operation with 30 years of history and the kind of reputation you build by never missing a deadline twice. His shop produced heavy steel components for construction firms, industrial plants, and infrastructure projects across the region. His equipment ran 16 hours a day. His crews ran 6 days a week. When a press break went down unexpectedly, it did not just delay one order, it backed up the entire floor, pushed 3 delivery schedules, and sent his project managers scrambling to make phone calls they hated making. When Hudson flagged his equipment downtime as a concern during a quarterly review, the existing Apex playbook had a clear answer. Schedule a phone consultation. Recommend a maintenance review. Deliver a summary within 12 billable hours. And close the ticket. Cameron's process. Clean and fast. I asked Hudson one question instead. Would it be all right if I came out and walked the floor myself? There was a pause on the line. Not suspicious. Just surprised. He said, "If you can handle steel-toed boots, I'll walk you through the whole place." When I told Cameron I wanted to do a site visit, she looked at me the way people look at someone who has just suggested something unnecessarily complicated. Field visits were not efficient. Billable hours needed to be controlled. Clients expected standardized service delivery. But Hudson was one of Apex's larger accounts. And the downtime problem was not going away. She approved it. Reluctantly. And I drove out 3 days later. The moment I stepped onto that floor, I understood why every phone call and every report template had failed him. Hudson's equipment was not running a normal industrial life. It was being pushed hard. Hydraulic press brakes, older than some of his workers, were still bending structural steel through multiple long shifts a day. Plasma cutting tables barely had time to cool between jobs. Everything was operating at high output, continuously. And the maintenance plan Apex had reviewed before my arrival had been built for standard manufacturer recommendations. Manufacturer recommendations written for equipment running moderate hours under moderate load. Hudson's machines were not living that life. I spent 2 weeks on site, walking with his maintenance supervisor, watching the press cycles, pulling oil samples, checking vibration on the stamp presses, logging temperature readings on hydraulic systems that were working harder than anyone on paper had acknowledged. Every machine had a story. I had learned to listen for the part of the story that nobody had written down yet. What I found was that the problem was not the equipment itself. The problem was the gap between how the equipment was being used and how it was being maintained. The preventive schedule was technically correct for a different factory. For Hudson's factory, it was leaving critical systems exposed to failure at exactly the wrong moments. I redesigned the maintenance protocol from scratch, built around actual usage patterns rather than calendar dates and manufacturer defaults. temperature monitoring on the hydraulic components that were running the hottest, vibration checks timed to production cycles, oil analysis schedules adjusted to reflect real-world strain. We brought in monitoring equipment. I helped retrain the crew on what they were watching for and why. And within the first quarter, the results were clear. Equipment downtime dropped by 23%. That translated to $47,000 in avoided production losses in the first 3 months alone. Hudson called me personally, not to thank me in the formal way, just to say, quietly, that this was the first time in years he felt like someone had actually understood what his shop needed. He signed a 3-year extension with Apex and referred 2 other fabrication companies to us. When I presented those results to Cameron, she looked at the billable hours. 34 hours, she said. The standard maximum is 12. Her tone was even, almost, gentle. Patrick, I appreciate the effort, but this is not a sustainable service model. She did not mention the $47,000. She did not mention the 3-year extension or the 2 referrals. The results did not appear anywhere in her response. Because to Cameron, the results were not the point. That was when I understood, with absolute clarity, that Cameron and I were not disagreeing about one project. We were living in 2 completely different definitions of what success meant. And I knew I needed to be careful about how I handled what came next. The second client was Wesley Porter, owner of Porter Freight Solutions. His fuel costs were climbing, his deliveries were running late, and his drivers were burning out on overtime hours that were not solving the underlying problem. Cameron's recommended approach was to implement one of 3 approved logistics software packages, cap the engagement at 16 billable hours, and deliver a standard efficiency report. I asked Wesley a few questions first. The story that came back did not match the software solution. I asked if I could spend a week in the yard, riding with his drivers, watching the operation from the ground level. Cameron sighed when I raised it. She mentioned protocols and resource management. I pushed, and she allowed it with a tone that made clear she was adding it to a mental file she was building against me. What I found at Porter Freight had nothing to do with routing software. Wesley's drivers were skilled and experienced. They knew every loading dock, every traffic pattern, every shortcut that took 3 minutes off a run. The problem was not on the road. The problem was in the distribution yard before the trucks ever left. Every morning, drivers arrived for their loads and waited. Average wait time was 45 minutes. Not because the staff was slow, because the incoming freight had been stacked without systematic separation. To get to the outbound shipments for Route 4, workers had to move the freight for routes 1, 2, and 3 every morning. The same inefficiency played out across the entire yard. And by the time trucks finally rolled out, they were already behind. The solution was not software. It was a cross-docking system that reorganized the staging areas by route. So incoming freight was sorted immediately, and outbound shipments were accessible without moving anything else. We reconfigured the floor layout, added some floor markings and shelving, ran a few days of staff retraining, and the change was immediate. Loading times dropped from 45 minutes to 12. Trucks left on time. Driver overtime disappeared almost entirely. Fuel consumption fell by around $18,000 per month because trucks were no longer idling in the yard. Wesley tripled his annual contract with Apex, from $80,000 to $240,000, and referred 3 additional logistics companies. When I presented those numbers to Cameron, her first comment was about the 52 billable hours I had spent. The protocol allows 16, she said. This is becoming a pattern. Patrick, the $18,000 monthly savings, the tripled contract, the 3 referrals, none of it appeared in her response. I was beginning to understand that, to Cameron, every result I delivered was less important than the fact that I had produced it outside her structure. My success was not evidence that her approach needed to change. It was evidence that I was a problem that needed to be managed. The third major engagement was with Garrett Walsh, owner of Walsh Construction Group. Garrett had been with Apex for close to 2 years and was on the edge of leaving. His company handled commercial builds across the region. Shopping centers, warehouses, office complexes. The kind of projects where a 2-week delay could trigger penalty clauses and damage relationships that had taken years to build. The previous consultants had given him scheduling software and milestone reports. None of it had worked. When I visited one of Garrett's active job sites, the problem was visible within the first hour. His project managers were running their projects as separate operations. Each one booked cranes, concrète, pour, and subcontractors independently, without visibility into what the other projects needed at the same time. A crane reserved for Tuesday on Project A might also be needed Tuesday on Project C. But neither project manager knew the conflict existed until the morning it happened. Then both projects lost half a day. Crews stood around waiting, and everyone scrambled to rebook. What Garrett needed was a centralized resource allocation system that gave all project managers visibility into the full equipment and labor schedule across every active job. Not a new app, not more reporting. A shared system that reflected real-time availability and let people coordinate without phone tag. I built the structure, implemented the master schedule, and spent several weeks working directly with Garrett's managers to help them use it properly. The results came quickly. Project completion times improved by 18% on average. Penalty clauses dried up. Crews stayed productive rather than idle. Garrett's annual contract jumped from $120,000 to $380,000. He referred 4 construction companies. When I told Cameron, she looked at the 87 billable hours. The construction protocol allows 24, she said. I think we need to have a serious conversation about your service delivery. I nodded. I said I understood. I walked back to my desk, and I started making a different kind of plan. A few months later, Cameron told me she was conducting an audit of my work. Every client assessment, every operational analysis, every implementation report, every hour logged over the past 18 months. She framed it as a performance review, but the weight behind it was clear. She wanted documentation she could use. She wanted the file to look unflattering enough that whatever she was planning next would be easy to justify. I spent 3 weeks building the audit she asked for. I compiled everything: Hudson's maintenance protocol and the downtime reduction, Wesley's cross-docking redesign and the monthly fuel savings, Garrett's resource allocation system and the completion rate improvement, every client whose contract had been renewed or expanded, every referral those clients had generated, every dollar of additional revenue that could be traced back to my extended hours and on-site work. By the time I finished, the document was 73 pages long. It showed, clearly and with supporting data, that my billable hours had generated more than $420,000 in additional annual revenue for Apex. It showed that client retention for the accounts I managed had climbed from 62% to 89%. I was proud of that document, not because I needed Cameron to read it and change her mind. By then, I had stopped expecting that. I was proud of it because it told the truth about what the work had actually cost and what it had actually produced. I submitted it and waited. A week later, Cameron sent a calendar invitation to the entire department. 31 people: analysts, account managers, junior consultants, senior directors who almost never attended routine service meetings. The subject line read, Service Delivery Realignment. When I walked into the conference room and saw my audit already loaded on the main screen, something in my stomach went quiet. Cameron welcomed everyone. She thanked them for coming. She announced that my work would serve as a case study in why Apex needed to return to efficient, scalable consulting protocols. Then she began, page by page. She walked the room through 18 months of results and described each one as a liability. Site visits became excessive use of company resources. Custom solutions became unsustainable client commitments. Detailed technical analysis became a pattern of disregarding established service standards. She mentioned the hours over and over. She never mentioned the contracts. She never mentioned the referrals. She never mentioned the $420,000. The room was quiet in a way that felt like held breath. I watched a few of my colleagues glance at the data on the screen and then look away quickly. The way people do when they see something that makes them uncomfortable, but they do not know what to do with it. Cameron moved through her argument carefully, building a case that my approach was the problem. That depth was inefficiency. That the real solution was faster turnaround and fewer hours per client. Then she moved the cursor over the delete button, and the audit was gone. 73 pages. 18 months. Gone. The room went very still. I looked at the blank screen for a moment. Then I picked up my folder, leaned back slightly in my chair, and said nothing. Cameron was waiting for a reaction. I did not give her one. She wrapped up the meeting with language about realigning to core service standards, announced that all analyst workflows would be reviewed, and dismissed the group. People filed out without making much eye contact. A few junior analysts who I had worked alongside looked at me with something that was not quite sympathy but was close to it. I drove home that evening and sat for a long time at my kitchen table. She had just handed me everything I needed. Here is what Cameron never knew. I had made copies of every piece of that audit weeks before I submitted it. Not because I was planning anything dramatic, because I had spent 24 years in industrial operations, and I had learned a long time ago that the only records you can trust are the ones you keep yourself. She had deleted the version on the company server. She had not deleted anything else. In the weeks that followed, I had several quiet conversations. Hudson Reeves was the first call I made. I explained that I was considering a transition and wanted to understand whether the relationship had been with Apex as a company or with the quality of the work itself. Hudson did not hesitate. He said he had stayed with Apex because of me and would follow the work wherever it went. Wesley Porter said almost exactly the same thing. Garrett Walsh told me he had already been thinking about whether to renew with Apex at all. Now that the project schedule was running smoothly and he was less dependent on active consulting, he said if I was building something independent, he would rather put that renewal money there. I spent 3 months preparing. I reviewed my employment contract carefully. I registered Sterling Operations LLC. I set up proper client service agreements. I prepared transition documentation that gave every client a clear, clean picture of what continued support would look like. I was methodical about it because I had seen people leave industries the wrong way, burning bridges out of anger rather than building something better with the same energy. When I resigned from Apex, I gave 30 days notice and completed every open assignment on my desk. I did not recruit clients while still on payroll. I did not send negative communications about the company. I left documentation for whoever would take over my accounts. What happened after that was not something I arranged. It was simply what happened when clients were given a choice. Within 6 weeks of my departure, Apex lost 8 major industrial accounts. Hudson, Wesley, Garrett, and 5 of the referral clients they had brought in. The accounts that left represented the core of Apex's industrial operations revenue. The company spent the following months trying to replace that revenue with the same 12-hour templates and standardized dashboards that had been failing for years. It did not work. Within the year, Apex laid off 40% of its staff and completed a distressed merger with a larger firm. Cameron was not retained in the transaction. There was no confrontation, no angry email, no moment where I looked her in the eye and explained what she had cost herself. I never needed any of that. Sterling Operations grew faster in its first year than I had projected. I was promoted to senior partner with equity in the firm within 6 months. The clients who followed me did not come because I had made promises or lowered my rates. They came because they had already seen the difference between a consultant who protected a process and one who protected their business. What I kept thinking about, in the quieter moments of that first year, was that meeting, the conference room, the 31 people, the blank screen, where 73 pages used to be. Cameron thought she was erasing something. But here's the part she missed. She could delete files. She could not delete the downtime. Hudson stopped losing. She could not delete the fuel Wesley stopped wasting. She could not delete the penalty clauses Garrett stopped paying. She could not delete the 3-year contracts and the tripled revenue and the referrals that had already happened. The work had already touched the real world. The evidence was not on a server. It was in the operations of real companies. run by real people, who knew exactly what it had taken to fix what had been broken. That is the thing about real solutions. They leave a record no one can delete. Cameron believed that controlling the process was the same as controlling the outcome. She believed that if she managed the documentation, she managed the story. What she never understood was that the story had already been written in $420,000 of additional revenue, in 3 clients who expanded their contracts, in 8 referrals who came because one person had been willing to put on steel-toed boots and walk a factory floor. I do not think about her often, but when I do, I think about that delete button and the look on her face right after she pressed it. That satisfaction, that certainty that she had just handled something difficult. And I think about how long she must have held on to that feeling before the client started calling to say they were leaving. I never had to say a word. I just had to let the work speak. If you have ever watched someone in authority try to erase good work to protect bad decisions, you know exactly what that conference room felt like. And if this story stayed with you, I want to hear from you. Would you have stayed quiet like Patrick did, gathering every piece of evidence and letting the outcome arrive on its own? Or would you have walked out that same day and never looked back? Tell me in the comments below. There is no wrong answer. And I genuinely want to know. And if you believe that real work always leaves evidence no one can erase, subscribe to Alex's Revenge. New stories every week. About betrayal, patience, and the kind of justice that does not need an audience to be real.